So let's talk this morning about skillful and unskillful emotions, something I think we all can relate to. And one of the basic tenets of the Buddha's teachings was addressing the need to manage our emotions, both our healthy emotions and our less healthy emotions, as we move and progress on the spiritual path. And this is a challenge which is really fundamental to achieving equanimity, and especially the foundational part of it is accepting things as they are, not as we want them to be. And we typically label or just use the umbrella term of reactivity to define um, states when we're controlled by our emotions, when we're just, sort of a prisoner of our emotions. When we are reactive, our emotions tend to be unskillful. They tend to cause greater suffering for ourselves and others. And I often just subsume um, all dukkha, all suffering, as reactivity under the heading of reactivity. And hopefully that'll become more clear as we talk this morning. But when we're not reactive, when we're not in a reactive mode, our mind is at ease. Reactivity has many manifestations on an individual level. It can involve anger, resentment, regret, shame, guilt. I mean, any unskillful emotion would could be classified as a form of reactivity. In a relational context, reactivity is often conflict, competition, winning, the ego taking over, and then socially and culturally, taking sides, us versus them, often involves a huge element of reactivity. But the common denominator of all of those is greater suffering. The Pali word chitta, spelled Citta, is usually translated from the Pali to mean heart mind. And the Buddha sort of talked about them as one entity, um, because he construed consciousness as made up of both thoughts and emotions, therefore heart mind, chitta. And heart mind really refers to the emotional part of the mind. It thought refers to the volitional quality of mind, meaning we have choices here, but we have to exercise those choices. And those choices can be skillful or unskillful. They can cause suffering or they can reduce suffering. And when we talk about unskillful mindsets, we're talking about becoming contracted, shutting down, distracted, inflated, unworkable, all these terms which suggest that we're dealing with unskillful emotions. And the path here to awareness is through intention. We set an intention. We disengage from that reactive sort of hair trigger modality, and we use our discernment. Okay. And the challenge for us is to see where we get caught, see where we get triggered, see where we get hooked. Okay. Because that is where reactivity occurs. And if we're not paying attention mindfully, if we're not noticing, if we're not pausing, if we're not using wisdom, chances are we're going to be in reactive mode. And when we're in non-reactive mode, when we're skillful, it's characterized by qualities like spaciousness, focus, compassion, humility, all the good stuff we talk about. But it can also be dominated by unskillful emotions. Okay. And the Buddha talked about, he used the term, the translated term is taken hold of by either pleasant or unpleasant emotions. And he said the unpleasant ones represent bondage. Their absence is, he talked about in terms of freedom. So he's using that metaphor of freedom versus bondage to characterize skillful versus unskillful emotions. But when we're in a skillful mindset, there's an open and spacious quality. And that's a kind of a way of knowing that we're there. We see things kind of in the larger picture. So let's dig a little more into reactivity. And one of the ways I think to best illustrate this is the parable that we of the two arrows that we often talk about. The first arrow is the unavoidable realities of life, loss, disappointment, sadness, regret. The reactivity is the second arrow. That's when we start loading up with all the the interpretations, the stories, the self-blame, the resentments, all the second arrow stuff. This is all from the Salatha Sutta, and we talked about the second arrow. That's what probably my favorite parable out of the Pali Canon. In other words, we're reflexively responding to these triggers, to our emotions, without considering our response. It's unskillful, it's reactive, it's shoot from the hip, it's hair trigger, whatever metaphor you want to use. And the tendency toward that is both somewhat hardwired, but it's also informed by our developmental path. Okay. It's formed through all the sources of craving and clinging that we talk about, that things should be different than they are. We don't like it. We want it to be different. We cling to the fact that it should be a certain way and it's not. And so reactivity develops from all the causes and conditions, often unconscious, and they can be traced to, early childhood stuff, wounds that we have from way back when about intimacy, autonomy, security, validation. All of that are ripe ground for reactivity. And once we begin to delve into that, the non-judgmental recognition of what's going on inside of us is the beginning of the solution for this reactivity. It requires, as does everything in our practice, mindful inquiry. Subtle levels of inquiry. For example, think about anger. Usually there's three elements that we can break anger down. There's a mental image, a picture. Oh, that guy cut me off in traffic. There's mental talk. That's so and so, so and so. And then there's the emotional bodily response, the adrenaline, the cortisol, the sort of getting contracted and tight. So, so, discernment helps us see that. The mental image, the picture that flashes, or the thing that happens in front of us, the guy cuts me off, my mental talk about his terrible driving and how dare he, and then the body responds. And now I'm off to the races. And typically that happens outside of conscious awareness. It happens in a wink of an eye. But the solution is to begin to notice these effects. Notice the things that make up our subjective world and meet those feelings with intention and awareness. And this is the ongoing practice of bringing the Dharma into our lives. We set an intention to notice our reactivity, using that, any of those things, the mental image, the mental talk, or the body sensations, as a red flag to say, whoops, I better stop and pay attention. In other words, we respond mindfully versus react. We pause, we release the pressure, we let go, and we act with integrity. And working this practice, working with the heart mind, must always be predicated upon the strong ethical foundation that we talked about on Wednesday. It has to be informed by our ethics, by our values. We remember that this disturbance is the challenge of our path, these disturbances. They are what hinder us from having more freedom, having more spaciousness. If things are easy, if things are not causing suffering, then, there's no wake-up call there. I use the analogy often, if we've got a toothache, we go to the dentist. If we're suffering, we want to look into the cause of the suffering, because feelings that are felt fully, mindfully held, can be surmounted through wisdom and released negative, unskillful feelings. And we remember that the ground of this path is the nature of reality. Things as they are, not as we want them to be. And then another component is self-compassion, because that gives us the freedom to shine the light, this flashlight, into those dark, ugly corners of ourselves, the part we don't want to look at. And by doing that, we gain acceptance of all facets of who we are. And when we do that, we automatically reduce our reactivity, because if you do something that taps into a disavowed part, I'm probably going to fly off the handle. I don't want to go there. But if I say, yeah, that's part of me, it's a big deal, then I'm going to be less reactive. Knowing the effects of acting from reactivity in an intentional way is the path. Noticing how we feel, how it affects our body, our energy level, our mind state for the minutes, hours, and days to follow to reduce our suffering. Being able to name our reactivity in the moment and when we are not reactive as a way of kind of preparing for those moments. So that's the kind of contrast between skillful and unskillful. And there's much more to say about it, but I'm going to leave it there for today. But I just wanted to do the overview of it since we haven't talked about it in a while. So let me stop and remember to